Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today, inshallah, we are going to discuss chapter 9. We will take some practical exercises on this chapter. So, let's begin with these exercises or questions. As you see, the first question is, at every point along the aggregate demand curve, assuming no foreign sector, what is the correct answer? The correct answer is Y equals C plus I plus G at equilibrium, right? The decrease in money or the quantum of money demanded, decrease in the quantum of money demanded, money supply leads to what? Decreasing money supply, increasing R, decrease I, decrease aggregate expenditure, and decrease aggregate demand. So there is a leftward shifting in the aggregate demand curve, right? So the best answer is a decreasing in aggregate demand. Number 3, an increase in the government purchases shifts what to a curve to what? Exactly. So the increase in the government spending or expansion of fiscal policy leads to increasing aggregate demand. So there is a rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve. What else? The aggregate demand curve would shift to the left if what? So let's come back quickly to analyze or to review the main determinants of aggregate demand curve. The main determinants of aggregate demand curve is the expansionary fiscal, the fiscal and monetary policy. Number 1, suppose, or the expansion of fiscal policy. If the government spending increase, the aggregate demand will shift to the right? If the government spending declined, leads to a leftward shifting in the aggregate demand curve. What about the expansion policy? Decreasing money supply leads a leftward shifting in the aggregate demand curve. And vice versa, the increasing of money supply leads to a decreasing R, increase I, increase aggregate demand. What about the discount rate, the relationship between the discount rate, the required reserve ratio, and the buying or purchasing bonds? Suppose that the federal decided to increase the discount rate. This leads to what? To decrease the money supply. And then this leads to increase R, decrease I, and decrease the aggregate demand. So there is what? An inverse relationship between the discount rate and the aggregate demand. And vice versa for sure. The decreasing in the discount rate leads to increasing aggregate demand. What about the required reserve ratio? The increasing in the required reserve ratio leads to a decreasing money supply because there is an inverse relationship between the money supply and the required reserve ratio, which leads to the same direction, increasing R, decreasing I, and finally decrease aggregate demand. So there is an inverse relationship between the required reserve ratio and the aggregate demand. What about the buying bonds or selling bonds or the government securities? Suppose, or the buying bonds leads to what? Increasing money supply, decrease R, increase I, increase the aggregate demand. So there is a rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve, right? So what do you see? There is a direct relationship or positive relationship between the buying bonds and the aggregate demand. The selling bonds leads to a decreasing in the aggregate demand. So all the following questions will talk about these issues and analysis, right? Okay? What about the prices and the quantity of aggregate demanded? The increasing the prices leads to a decreasing in the quantity of aggregate demanded. So we will work along the same demand curve, right? يعني زيادة في الأسعار بتؤدي إلى انخفاض في الكمية المطلوبة الكلية. So we will still work along the same demand curve. Yes, the same. But these changes in the required reserve ratio, the discount rate, the government spending, the net taxes. What about the net taxes? Net taxes, increasing the net taxes, it has the same effect of decreasing the government spending, which leads to a decrease in aggregate demand. For sure, إن زيادة الضرائب حتقلل الطلب الكلي، صح? And vice versa for sure. So this question is, the aggregate demand curve would shift to the left if what? If the net taxes were increased. And in this exercise or this example, a decrease in the net taxes leads to what? Increasing aggregate demand. صح? طيب. A rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve could be caused by what? By the federal buying bonds. صح? طيب. Let's go to this diagram or figure. As you see, we have points A, B, and C, D, and A. Suppose that we would like, or we shift from A to B. What are the main causes for the shifting from A to B? From A to B, or aggregate demand node to aggregate demand what? What are the main causes for this, or reasons for? No, the prices affect or will shift A to E or A to D. But the shifting from A to B may be caused by what, Muhammad? Exactly, increasing the government spending, increasing the money supply, decreasing the discount rate. Exactly. So these are the main reasons for a rightward shifting the aggregate demand curve, or from A to B, right? And vice versa from B to A. But what about the shifting or the transfer from A to E? May be caused by an increase in the price level. No. Income affects the money demand and then the interest rate. So we have a rightward shifting or leftward shifting, the increasing in income. So let's go to the exercises. And refer to the figure. An aggregate demand shifts or shift from aggregate demand 2 to aggregate demand 0 can be caused by what? هذا اللي ناقشناه لقيت انه بدي انتقل من هان لهان. Maybe by what, or from aggregate demand 1 to 0 by what? Okay. So we have, and the shifting from aggregate demand 1 to 0 may be caused by decrease in the government spending, اللي هو leftward shifting. Refer to the figure. Suppose that the economy is at point A. Now, suppose that we are at point A. An increase in the price level can cause a movement to point 1. So suppose, let's come back to the diagram here. From A to B, from A to E may be caused by increase in the price level, or the increase in the price level leads to increasing or shifting to the point A, E. The decrease in the price levels may be lead to shifting to point D, right? Okay. Suppose the economy is at point A. The increase in money demand could cause a movement to point what? هلا اللي صار عندي increasing في money demand. شو بوين بوديني هذا؟ So let's analyze. I don't know, we have to analyze. So suppose that we are at point A, the increasing in money demand leads to what? Increasing in R leads to increase R, decrease I, decrease aggregate expenditure and aggregate demand. So there is a leftward shifting in the aggregate demand curve. So we will shift to point C. Let's come back. هذا يعمل لي ايش؟ leftward shifting. Suppose that we are at point A, there is a leftward shifting to point C. صح؟ طيب. Suppose that we are at point A decrease in the government purchases. هذا وين بودينا؟ على منحنى ثاني اللي هو على السي برضو. صح؟ اوكي. True or false? A higher interest rate increases both planned investment and consumption. Is it true or false? False, because the increasing in R leads to a decreasing in I. صح? Okay. Exactly. Number 2, a decrease in the net taxes or taxation increases the aggregate demand. صح ولا غلط؟ صح. True. A decrease in the price level raises the real value of wealth. the prices لما بتنزل real wealth ثروتك الحقيقية بتزيد. It's true. The increase in the supply of money will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. صح ولا غلط؟ مظبوط. True. Yes. Because increasing money supply increase the aggregate demand. The decrease in the government purchases or government spending shifts the aggregate demand to the left. Okay. True. The aggregate demand curve shows that at higher price levels, لما بتكون الأسعار عالية, the total quantity of output demanded is greater, بتزيد. غلط. Okay. If the federal buys government securities, إذا رايحين مشتريين bonds, الماني supply بيزيد, وبالتالي أنا بقولنا إنه decrease في الماني supply غلط. This leads to increasing money supply and the aggregate demand. صح? The last point. An increase in the price level causes the aggregate demand to increase. زيادة في الأسعار بتزود aggregate demand? لا. Okay. So let's go to the shape of the aggregate supply curve. This is the short-term aggregate supply curve, right? Where's the capacity, the full capacity point? At point or at the production of $1,500. Okay? Suppose that we work at point 500 or at Y 500. It's, as you know, it's below the capacity, below the full capacity, right? If the aggregate demand increased from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2, this leads to what? This leads to increasing the aggregate output, the prices and the aggregate output. صح؟ مظبوط؟ طيب. Suppose that we work closed or relatively near the capacity or the full capacity. We are close to the full capacity. يعني suppose ان احنا بنشتغل هنا at 1,200, right? The increasing of aggregate demand from aggregate demand 3 to aggregate demand 4 leads to what? A higher increasing in the prices with a small increase in what? Right? طب وين بتكون ال fiscal policy is more effective? هان ولا هان? In the first, exactly. When the aggregate supply is close to horizontal line, لما بيكون قريب من horizontal line, in this case, the fiscal policy and monetary policy would be more effective. تمام? But here, it should be less effective. At point, suppose this is point M, and the government decided to increase its spending or use an expansion fiscal policy. This leads to increasing aggregate demand, but with no change on or in the aggregate output. So after the capacity or at the full capacity, the increasing or the using an expansion fiscal policy or monetary policy would not change Y, would not increase Y. So here we have what? We have an inflationary gap. صح? Because we have only increasing the price level. That's it. مظبوط؟ هلا بعد عند نقطة الفول كاباسيتي هنا عند النقطة أم شو الزيادة اللي في الأجريجيت ديماند عملت؟ ولا حاجة. Increasing the prices. بس. صح؟ But with no change in Y. So is or does the fiscal policy effective or not? It's not effective, exactly. What about the monetary policy in this case? Suppose that this federal increase the money supply. The aggregate demand will increase, but with no change in Y. So does the monetary policy effective or not? It's not effective. تمام؟ تمام. طيب, I have another question. Suppose that we are at point K here. And the government decided to decrease its spending. Do we have a recession?
No.
No. Because why would remain constant?
There's no change.
But what would happen to the unemployment if the government decided to decrease its spending? يعني كنا عند الكي هان ورحنا مزودين, this is aggregate demand 4, and the government 5, and the government decided to use a contraction of fiscal policy by decreasing the government spending or increasing the net taxes. راحوا مقللين الانفاق تبعهم. What would happen to the unemployment rate? Sorry? Exactly, constant. Because at this point, point K here, if we are working over the full capacity or above the full capacity. So, in this case, if the government used a contraction of fiscal policy by decreasing the government spending or increase the taxes or the net taxes, should we see the aggregate demand would decline, but no change or unchanged in why. So there is no change in the unemployment rate or recession. صح؟ بس هان, suppose we work at point F. In this case, if the government used a contractionary fiscal policy, this leads to a decreasing in aggregate demand. And so, at point F, if the government use a contraction of fiscal policy or the federal use a contraction of monetary policy, then we have a leftward shifting in the aggregate demand curve from aggregate demand 3 to aggregate demand 2. And in this case, the inflation would decline. Why would decline? And the unemployment rate would increase. Because we work below the full capacity. Okay, but after the capacity, any increasing or decreasing the government spending would not change why, so would not change the recession, would not change the unemployment. صح؟ طب شو relationship ما بين unemployment والoutput, aggregate output? Inverse, exactly. صحيح. طيب, let's go to the questions and exercises. So here, between the output level of 500 billion and 1000 billion, the relationship between the price level and output is what? هلا في المنطقة هذه ما بين ال 500 وال 1000 شو العلاقة ما بين the prices والoutput? The prices increase will y increase, so it should be positive. لو انتقلنا بالعكس, decreasing should be positive. تمام? So the relationship between the aggregate output on the price level is positive. طيب, what else? This economy reaches capacity at قديش? 1500. صحيح. Okay, when the aggregate supply curve is a vertical, which of the following is not true? إذا كان منحنى aggregate supply عمودي vertical, أنو من هدول مش صحيحة. D, the economy is expanding quickly. There's no change in the economy in this case. صحيح, it should be constant. طيب. If the economy is operating on the relatively vertical segment, يعني الاقتصاد شغال قريب من الفول كاباسيتي, يعني مش واصل لسه الفول كاباسيتي بس قريب منه. تمام? Of the aggregate supply curve, an increase in the aggregate demand curve, زيادة cause what? يعني الزيادة اللي بتصير في aggregate demand شو بتعمل؟ فراغ change in the price level and فراغ change in output. يعني suppose بدي ارجع شوي هيك, احنا قريبين من الفول كاباسيتي, يعني احنا بنشتغل هنا هيك. بقولنا انه الانكريز في الاجريجيت ديماند شو بتعمل؟ from aggregate demand to aggregate demand 2 بتعمل larger change or bigger change في البرايس with smaller change in Y. صح؟ Okay. If the economy is operating way below capacity means هنا بيقصد انه في منطقة اللي هي قريب بيكون horizontal line الاجريجيت expenditure بيكون قريب من الافقي. هلا مين بيكون فيه زيادة وعندنا الاجريجيت ديماند زاد. شو بيعمل؟ Exactly. في عندنا small increase في ال prices and large increase في ال aggregate output. يعني هدف وين؟ Exactly. بتكون ال expansion fiscal policy and monetary policy is effective. هذا لما بيكون وين؟ لما بيكون ال aggregate supply جاي horizontal line أو قريب من ال horizontal يعني أو مش واصل ال capacity يعني في المرحلة القريبة هي. طيب the an increase in the aggregate demand when the economy is operating at high level of output is likely result in. هلا لما بكون احنا الاجريت اوتبوت عالي كتير شو اللي بصير؟ شو هي؟ an increase in the overall price level but little or no increase in output. خلينا نرجع لها هيو. لا هو بقولنا انه احنا اذا كان الايكونومي بيشتغل near the capacity يعني قريب من الكاباسيتي هاي يعني يا اما هان هيك او هان في المناطق هذه شو الوضع؟ الانكريزنج في الاجريجيت ديماند بيزيد البرايسز with a small واي يا اما بيكون في عندي small change او لما بكون واصل هنا في منطقه الفول كاباسيتي no change. تمام؟ Okay, when the economy is operating at full capacity is likely result to what? طبعا هيكون عندي increasing flip prices with no change in Y. تمام؟ هذا وين؟ at full capacity عند نقطة الفول capacity. Exactly اللي هي بتعمل it would create the inflationary gap problem. طيب when the economy is producing at full capacity the aggregate supply curve becomes what? Vertical. Yes. طيب let's go. Yes.
لما نستعمل عند نقطة الفول كاباسيتي لما نستعمل الاكسبانشن مونيتور او الفيسكال بيعمل لنا هايبر انفليشن
بيعمل sustained inflation بيعمل ايش بسموه inflationary gap الفجوة التضخمية. طبعا وجايين لشغله اسمها sustained inflation كمان شوي. تمام؟ طيب let's go to this figure or diagram. As you see aggregate supply 1, aggregate supply 0, aggregate supply 2. Let's go to the exercises. An increase in the aggregate supply is represented by what? الزيادة في الاجريجيت سبلاي تمثل بالانتقال من وين لوين؟ From aggregate supply 1 to aggregate supply 0 or from aggregate supply 2 to aggregate supply 1 or from aggregate 2 to 0. صح؟ 1 to 0. 1 to 0. Yes, it's the right word shifting the aggregate supply curve. مظبوط. Refer to the figure. A decrease in the aggregate supply is represented by the backward shifting or the leftward shifting for the aggregate supply. Okay. Let's go to this diagram. Let's go to this or to the exercise. Suppose the economy is at point A. Suppose إنه إحنا وين؟ عند point A. تمام؟ إيش شو تبي؟ And the increase or the increase in the price level. هلا الزيادة في الأسعار بودينا على وين؟ From A to B here. Along the same aggregate supply curve. طب the decreasing في prices وين بوديني؟ I see exactly. صحيح. طيب هلا the shifting from A to E.
decrease in the aggregate supply.
Okay, but what are the main reasons or causes for this? Maybe the wages increase. The wages. Exactly. Maybe the cost of production increased. When the cost of production increase, the ability for producing more and more would decline, so the aggregate supply will shift to the left. Yes. Okay. My question is, suppose that the economy works at point A, right? The shifting to the point E may be caused by what? ممكن انه زاد او انتقلنا من aggregate supply 0 ل aggregate supply 2 لان ال cost production increased او wages زاد maybe and vice versa for sure. طيب. Let's go to this diagram. As you see, where is the equilibrium point? The equilibrium point E, and the equilibrium aggregate output is $600 million, right? Or billion. طيب. Now suppose, or let's go to the, suppose the equilibrium output is initially $600 billion. The expansionary monetary policy فراغ equilibrium output and فراغ the prices. لو استخدمنا expansionary monetary policy or maybe increasing the money supply. يعني لو رحنا مزودين الموني supply. طبعا هذا بيعمل لو انه هون بأثر على الاجريجيت demand هذا. This leads to increasing the aggregate demand. صح؟ مش increase في الموني supply شو بيعمل في aggregate demand؟ بيزودوا لانه it should decrease R, increase I, increase the aggregate demand. صح؟ So there is a rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2, which leads to increasing prices increased in Y. صح؟ هذا السؤال. So suppose, or they refer to the figure, suppose the economy or the equilibrium output is initially 600 billion, a decrease in wages and increase in the government spending. شو بيعمل؟ في الاجريجيت output. هلا كنا عند الانيشال عند الايكويليبريم تمام؟ والاسامبشن از انه صار في عندي decrease في الويج or في الويجز وانكريز في الجفرمنت سبيندينج. هذا شو بيعمل؟ Let's do the analysis. هلا السؤال انه في عندنا two cases. الاول انه صار في عندي decreasing في الويجز وانكريزing في الجفرمنت سبيندينج. هلا decreasing في الويجز increase or decrease the cost of production. Increase aggregate supply, so there is a rightward shifting of the aggregate supply curve. صح؟ طيب increasing اللي صار في government spending شو عمل؟ increasing في government spending increase aggregate demand. طب إذا صار في عندي increasing في aggregate demand و increasing في aggregate supply. طب شو اللي صار؟ هلا suppose انه صار في عندي increasing في الاجريجيت ديماند بهاي المسافه هيك aggregate demand 1 to 2 تمام والاجريجيت سبلاي برضه زاد ممكن يكون زاد باقل or the same or larger. شو اللي بتلاحظوه صار هلا let's take the first case. The price increased هان E1 Y increased تمام. طيب لو فرضنا انه الزياده اللي صارت في الاجريجيت ديماند بتساوي الاجريجيت سبلاي شو اللي صار؟ the price constant will Y increased صح؟ طيب لو كان الاجريجيت سبلاي الزياده في الاجريجيت سبلاي اكبر من الزياده في الاجريجيت ديماند the price would decline Y would increase. So in all cases for sure Y would increase صح؟ the price is ambiguous exactly صحيح. طيب اذا هذا for sure ايش حيعمل؟ حيعمل increasing the equilibrium output صح؟ طيب مين مش فاهم هاي النقطة؟ اهو answer C صحيح اللي هو بيعمل increasing في الايكوليبريم output. طيب to increase the price level عشان ان احنا نزود ال price level the government could adapt policies that what؟ هلا عشان ال government بدها ترفع ال prices شو لازم تعمل؟ لازم انهم يعملوا decreasing aggregate supply or increase the aggregate demand صح ولا لا؟ اذا يعملوا decreasing للاجريجيت supply and increase the aggregate demand. تمام. طب سؤال، هلا سبوز انه احنا كنا هان هيك، هاي بدي ارجع لها. لو بدنا نرفع البرايسز، بدنا نزود البرايسز من 1000 ل 1100، كيف ممكن نعمل؟ ممكن نزود الاجريجيت ديماند من اجريجيت ديماند 1 لاجريجيت ديماند 2، وبالتالي البرايسز بتطلع، صح؟ اذا in this case لازم الجفرمنت شو تعمل؟ تعمل adapt policies انها تزود الاجريجيت ديماند by maybe increasing the government spending، صح؟ او يزودوا الماني سبلاي، صح؟ طيب او انهم يجوا يعملوا decreasing للاجريجيت سبلاي، وبالتالي وين بنروح؟ بنيجي هان او بنيجي هان، البرايس بتطلع، صح؟
عشان يصير يسار يزيد الويتس،
يزيد تكليف الانتاج. ممكن. طيب I have another question. هلا الانكريزنج في او الديكريزنج في الاجريجيت سبلاي هذا شو اسمه؟ الليفتورد شيفتنج اللي صار في الاجريجيت. Exactly, it's called the cost push inflation. صح؟ التضخم اللي جاي نتيجة زيادة التكاليف. طب هذا الكوست بوش انفليشن شو عمل في الايكونومي؟ ياسر؟ شو عمل بالايكونومي هذا؟ The cost push inflation شو عمل؟ inflation صحيح؟ وش عمل في الواي؟ decrease في الواي. إذا شو عمل؟ عمل inflation with employment اللي هو recession or stagflation. stagflation لأنه أنا شو عندي أنا هنا؟ recession with inflation. المرة الجاية تيجي جاهز. تمام؟ طيب. طب هذا إذا هذا الكوست بوش انفليشن شو عمل؟ عمل stagflation. صح؟ طيب الديماند بول انفليشن شو بيعمل؟ ديماند بول انفليشن. لحظة let's do an analysis. الديماند بول انفليشن شو عمل؟ يعني عملنا زيادة في الاجريجيت ديماند. وش بيعمل في الانمبلويمنت؟ بيزود الناتج وبالتالي بيقلل الانمبلويمنت، صح؟ إذا مين أثره أفضل أو خلينا أقل ضررا على الايكونومي؟ الديماند بول، لأنه الديماند بول انفليشن شو عمل؟ أو سوري يس الديماند بول عمل انفليشن وحل مشكلة الانمبلويمنت، صح؟ الكوست بوش انفليشن creates two problems: inflation and recession, which is the stagflation. صح؟ طيب. لا هيكون شاطرين بتحللوا ما شاء الله. طيب let's go to this diagram. طيب as you see in this diagram we have the short run aggregate supply curve وال long run aggregate supply curve. مظبوط؟ Where is the potential GDP without inflation? البوتنشال جي دي بي هو وين تقاطع اللونج ران اجريجيت سبلاي. اذا وين بيكون؟ 700. صح؟ مظبوط ولا لا؟ طيب لو فرضنا انه suppose انه الجفرمنت used an expansion fiscal policy by increasing the government spending، راحوا مزودين الجفرمنت spending. هلا suppose this is the initial aggregate demand curve. This is the aggregate demand 1. شو اللي بصير في الاجريجيت ديماند؟ يعني لو رحنا عاملين expansion fiscal policy increasing the government spending شو بيعمل؟ increasing للاجريجيت demand. So there is a rightward shifting at the aggregate demand curve. صح؟ إذا وين حنيجي؟ لاجريجيت demand 2 وبالتالي suppose إنه إجا هيك. aggregate demand 2. What should happen to the aggregate output in the short run and the long run؟ هلا شو اللي صار للاجريجيت اوتبوت في الاجل القصير في الاجل الطويل؟ هلا في الاجل القصير وين جينا؟ زادت واي انكريز فروم 700 ل 800، صح؟ اذا اجينا لوين؟ للنقطة هاي. بس في الاجل الطويل شو الوضع؟ ليش؟ اوكي But what are the main causes of the crowding out in this case? Okay, let's come back to the analysis. As you see, this is the original price level, P1. تمام? The rightward shifting in the aggregate demand curve in the short run, شو عمل? Increase the prices. This is E1 to E2. The prices increased from P1 to B2. صح? The increasing in the price level leads to what? Increasing. So let's follow the analysis here. And the first case, when the government spending increase, this leads to increasing aggregate demand, which leads to increasing in the prices, right? If the prices increased, the wages would increase. صح؟ اللي هي cost production. So this leads to increasing the wages. وليش الwages زادت؟ لأنه لما البرايسز طلعت صاروا العمال بيطالبوا بدهم أجور أعلى. غلاء معيشة. So this leads to increasing the cost of production, which leads to a decreasing in aggregate supply curve, or leftward shifting in the aggregate supply curve. So in the long term, we have a leftward shifting in the aggregate supply curve. We will reach to this point, aggregate supply to. Here we have we will come back to the potential GDP in the long term. تمام؟ هذه النقطة this is E1, E2, E3. هلا E1 is the potential GDP without inflation. صح؟ E3 the potential GDP with inflation. صح؟ E2 is the aggregate output or the actual output in the short run. صح؟ مظبوط ولا لا؟ الناتج الحقيقي في الأجل القصير هيو 800. هذا البوتنشال output is $700 billion in the long term. إذن potential GDP or potential equilibrium output أنا هو هذا. إيش هو potential GDP؟ هو long run aggregate supply. صح؟ هلا شباب البوتنشال جي دي بي or potential Y potential aggregate output شو هو؟ سواء without inflation or with inflation هو شو عبارة عن ايش؟ اللونج ران aggregate supply curve. مظبوط؟ هو اللونج ران aggregate supply. طيب how could we increase the potential GDP? How could we increase the potential GDP from 700 to 800? Increase the money supply. Increasing the money supply leads to increasing aggregate demand. So we have a sustained inflation. So it's not. Malo. Which aggregate supply? The long run aggregate supply, exactly. So to increase the potential GDP from 700 to 800, we have to increase the long run aggregate supply. صح؟ مظبوط؟ طيب let's go to the exercises. The potential output or the potential GDP in this case, طبعا refer to the figure. And the potential GDP or potential output is 700. Refer to the figure. The level of aggregate output that can be sustained in the long run without inflation. أنو potential output اللي بتضلها في long run is 700. تمام. The level of aggregate output can be sustained in the long run without inflation is known as what? Potential output. طيب. When the space فراغ increase, then the potential GDP increased. اللي هو long run aggregate supply. لما long run aggregate supply بيزيد شو اللي بصير؟ بنروح على potential GDP جديد. طيب the potential output is equal to what? The long run aggregate supply. From A to M. اللي هو leftward shifting of the aggregate supply curve عبارة عن ايش هذا؟ هذا الكوست push inflation. cost push inflation occurs if ايش؟ انه الاجريجيت سبلاي shift to the left. طيب for an economy to experience both a recession and inflation at the same time. لما بكون في عندنا inflation مع recession في نفس الوقت هذا اللي هو stagflation وبيجي نتيجة ايش؟ انه the leftward shifting of the aggregate supply curve. صحيح. تمام. طيب what about this figure? This is the aggregate demand, aggregate supply. The intersection between aggregate demand and aggregate supply here, if the government, or خلينا نشوف شوية, if the economy is currently at the intersection of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, the federal is most likely to طبعا increase the money supply to reduce the unemployment. عشان نخفض ال unemployment بدنا نزود الماني سبلاي لانه زياده الماني سبلاي شو بتعمل؟ بتعمل a rightward shifting في aggregate demand curve from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2, then Y would increase and unemployment would decline. Or it can increase the government spending or decrease the taxes, because here the fiscal policy and the monetary policy are effective. طب هنا in this case, here the potential GDP is what? Why not? مظبوط؟ طيب if the government used an expansionary fiscal policy, exactly, it's ineffective. The aggregate demand would increase without a change in Y. Yes, yes. So in this case, decrease. خلاص يعطيكم العافية.